Hi everybody, I'm here in my office on a snow day with Stefan Waldschmidt.
Hi.
That's Stefan. What we're doing now is called continuity of instruction. Our class was canceled due to a snowstorm, but instead of a snow day, you get to watch this video of us talking about Dracula and Foucault, which will be amazing, and you should organize a viewing party to watch it. What I'm going to ask is that everyone watch this video and then post to our class blog one short statement, just 25 words, 1 or 2 sentences, that's a response to what you see here and your own reading of Dracula and Foucault to this point. Before we start, I want to just thank Stefan for coming all the way from Durham to be here.
Thanks for having me here, too.
A quick word about who Stefan is. Stefan is an advanced graduate student, a PhD candidate at Duke University, whose work focuses on Victorian literature and the intersection between literary form and epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, something very close to our inquiries this semester. And Stefan has published an article in Victorian Studies, which is the leading journal in the study of the 19th century. And he's very accomplished and is now almost finishing up a dissertation right now. So we're really lucky to have him here in this version of the Zach Galifianakis interview between two ferns, right?
Did they know that reference?
Maybe not. Do you guys know that? Put that in your comments. Okay, so what we're going to do is have a kind of informal conversation now. I think what we decided is that we'd start by talking about Foucault. So if you guys at home want to pull up the PowerPoint, it's on the blog under course PDFs. You can follow along with us as we kind of talk through some Foucault. So Stefan, you would you want to start us off?
Yeah, I guess so. So Foucault, right? I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about what Foucault is doing here is the text is called The History of Sexuality, and what Foucault is kind of trying to do is he's not just trying to tell us the history of sexuality. He's trying to change the way we tell stories about the history of sexuality. So Foucault says there's this one story that we tell about the history of sexuality that we shouldn't tell anymore. That story is what he calls the repressive hypothesis. So basically the way the repressive hypothesis works, and you guys probably got this he talks about this a little bit in the Incitement to Discourse chapter that you guys read. The way the repressive hypothesis works, the way that story goes, is that for all of the 19th century, people didn't talk about sex, right? You know, this is as the period whenever, there was, a curvy piano leg, and then they'd, put a little, dressing leg around it because that would be too sexual for the Victorian drawing room, right? You know that story?
I do know that story.
Right, and, I mean,
British Victorians.
Yeah, or these, the corsets, right, that tie down the woman's, bellies or whatever, that try to, to make them invisible or something. So, Victorians didn't talk about sex, they couldn't talk about sex, they didn't want to talk about sex, and then around the 20th century, Virginia Woolf and a couple of her friends were in a flat somewhere, and then someone told a joke about masturbation, and everyone sort of tittered, ha-ha, and they're like, oh shit, we can talk about sex now. And then the 20th century was allowed to happen whenever we could be free and talk about sex and be open about it. And so we went from being repressed to being able to talk about sex. That's the repressive hypothesis.
That's a great story. That's not the true story.
Well, I mean,
Foucault says this is a cheap liberation narrative. These are fake liberation
stories. Does he actually use the word cheap liberation narrative?
I'm adding that. What do you think?
I mean, so
that's the story that Foucault says that he's trying to displace.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, so the story that Foucault wants to tell instead is slightly different. And that's the story that he calls the Incitement to Discourse. Now, according to the Incitement to Discourse story, actually, people have always been talking about sex. So, in the Incitement to Discourse chapter, around page 19, he kind of starts telling this story about how way back in the 17th century, there were in these Catholic countries, a peasant would go into confession, and he'd say, oh, Father, I have sinned. You know, the milkmaid was walking down the lane, and then I took her by the hand, and then, I don't know how explicit I can get in the video, but
We'll be on the internet.
Oh, yeah, okay. So maybe not...
I touched this, I licked that,
Right.
did those things.
Right.
Exhaustive catalog
right.
of sexual acts.
Right, and the reason why, the logic of this is that if you're going to confess your sexual sins to the priest, you obviously have to say all of them, otherwise the confession isn't complete. So of course, even in these Catholic countries, there's a whole protocol around talking about sex sort of infinitely and exhaustively. And as the narrative goes on, you don't simply talk about your acts. Instead, you start to talk about, like, the sexual identity you might have. So we have, like, our own sort of panoply of sexual identities that we ourselves identify with, like maybe straight, gay, heteroflexible, homosexual. What are some of the other ones? Just around.
You could imagine a drop-down menu on an internet dating site.
Yeah, right. So like,
which we might talk about in a second.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. And so, like, but this whole idea is that, like...
What were the Victorian ones?
Yeah, so the Victorians had their own kind of sexual identities. One of them, for example, that we don't seem to really have anymore now, but was certainly important for the Victorians, was you could have the sexual identity of being the masturbator. Now, what did it mean for the Victorians to be a masturbator, though? Like, it didn't just mean, like, you were a guy who masturbated. Like, there's a particular reason why people started to get interested in that particular category of being the masturbator. So it's not simply that you're a guy who does an act that is masturbating. It is rather that because you masturbate, because you're a masturbator, that might have effects for, like, how your children will pop out. That might, like, diminish your energy so you won't be able to work as well whenever you go into the workplace. Or, like, maybe you'll just start growing hair in weird places or something like that. Like, so the sexual identities that get developed in the 19th century are identities that are sort of linked into this whole analysis of society in general and what type of person you need to be in order to work in that society.
This is part of Foucault's abiding interest in the production of normalcy. And what are the technologies that produce the idea of the normal? And then
right.
We'll see this, and this just is a quick preview of why this isn't just a bunch of talking about sex. What do you do when someone starts eating flies in your jail cell? What name do you give that person? What category can he fit in? How can he be made to be understood by a bureaucratic apparatus of knowledge?
Right.
We'll see that in a second.
Right.
And this is why this has stakes for what happens in literature.
Yeah, and just in general, like, the way, the story that Foucault's talking about, like, it's like categories don't come from nowhere. Like, categories indicate areas of interest. People and things that are problems. And so whenever we start naming something or categorizing something, it's because there's a sort of social problem that we're trying to solve, or a particular way of being in society that it's all of a sudden important to start collecting data about. Right?
Yeah.
Let's see, is there other stuff we want to talk about in the... Oh, I know.
Yeah.
So like, one might kind of ask, well, okay, so that's the story, sort of the story of the incitement to discourse in the 19th century. But so, like, are we still living in the incitement to discourse today? What do you think, Nathan?
We're being made to speak into a video camera right now. I would say we still...
Are we being made to, or are we choosing to?